When one opens and reads that book, one can see it's a hybrid of themes and, genres. It's a family story, USA history, it's about the god of agriculture and medicine, about China mythology, about the ginseng workers' kids, about immigrants in ginseng industry, about the language, writing, trauma, etc., etc. It could be seen as a report, a diary, a memoir, a biography, a textbook, a history book, a crime book, a romance. It's very complex, tight and multi-layered, multidimensional. How do you see your own book? What is it for you?
I can't describe it better than you just did. That's perfect. We should use that as our descriptive copy. Yes, it is all those things. It is motivated by a desire to create a book about a plant and has a plant as the primary protagonist. It's also motivated by a desire to do a documentary journalistic work a la Joe Sacco, something truly nonfiction essay-based, based on interview footage. But finally, the glue that holds it together is it's another memoir like blankets. So half of the book and in the grounding element is my personal story, which is about my childhood, it's about my family, it's about my small town, and it's about a decade of my childhood working full-time during my summers in ginseng agriculture. Ginseng being Chinese medicinal herb, prized in traditional Chinese medicine. But this tiny American town I grew up in was the largest producer of cultivated American ginseng in the world when I was a child.
And I would say a way behind, because it seems to me you put the whole universe into that book, including some meta level of making of a book itself. How many stories are you telling us?
Maybe an infinite amount, There's always the macrocosm within the microcosm and vice versa. I'm sort of interested in that psychedelic vision of the universe. It's in Habibi too, I imagine. The book began with a desire to write about plants, a meditation on what plant I might have the most knowledge and intimacy with, realizing it was ginseng because of a decade of my childhood spent with the plant. And then I confronted the root itself. I dug up a ginseng root in Wisconsin. I put it in a jar with some vodka, make a mason jar eau de vie of ginseng. And I meditated with that plant, asking what was the story it had to tell me. I didn't want this to be an human-centric or egocentric narrative. And oddly and clearly, I heard the ginseng say, "Go back to where you came from," which I'm not sure how it was translated in Polish or German, but that sounds like an expression used in anti-immigrant hate speech. It's something you might imagine Trumpers shouting, "Go back to where you came from, go back to where you came from," to immigrants. But when I heard it from the plant, it was a gentle expression and a self-reflective expression. And it felt like the missing key to my midlife crisis. I'd spent my entire life running from the place where I grew up, and it was time for me to go back there and reconcile some of those issues.
You just mentioned that you were using or trying to make a journalistic work like Sacco. How much fiction is in that book?
I try to avoid fiction as much as possible. So I would say, you mentioned earlier there's Chinese mythology in there, so there's sprinkles of entertainment. And then there's just the inherently contrived nature of documentary to take the chaos of the world and reduce it into a digestible narrative requires a lot of manipulation in the editing room. So it's not fiction, but, there is a collaging, you mentioned collage earlier, that takes place to make things flow on a narrative scale.
Of course, it's about the dramaturgy and exactly telling a story. You use for the book mainly and continues two colors, black and red. The two have long tradition in print, black as the color of printed and drawn ink mostly and usual. Red has big tradition in Chinese wood carving, Chinese calligraphy and stamps. But red is also the printed color of spoken word of God in the Bible. So somehow it's all connected to the land of U.S. Ginseng Roots, industry in Wisconsin, classic wood prints, the deity. Am I seeing it right?
You're definitely seeing it right. Red is also the color of the ginseng fruit or berries. Ginseng famously is an elusive plant that hides itself from hunters in the woods. It's somehow naturally camouflaged in the woods and impossible to find, except during late summer, early fall, when it blossoms its fruit. These really vibrant red crimson berries that are like beacons in the forest. And my sister, who avoided ginseng work most of our childhood, the one task that she agreed to help out with was harvesting the seeds, because it was the easiest and most fun of tasks in ginseng. And I don't know, I have vivid memories of the pulpy, bright red of those berries and sort of the pleasure of harvesting them.
There is a lot of connection also to the story itself. Like, of course, you're very believing in God parents and trying to put the Bible and the God believers into you kids. And also the whole Chinese story of calligraphy and stamps. Why do you exactly use these two colors?
I mean, initially it was just a chance to try something new. And personally, black and white is my aesthetic preference in comics. I think it's the most pure form of comic storytelling. The market, unfortunately, seems to demand full color. One extra color, so a two-color format, seemed like the compromise. And it just gave me new tools to work with that I never had before in terms of creating volume in the drawings, all kinds of graphic design possibilities that I didn't have before. And then something like a bit of a homage to printing techniques too. I really nerded out on both woodblock printing and that simplicity, but also more complicated overprint printing techniques where you're layering gray tones in different tones of the red to create all these earthy sepia tones. And it was just a stimulating new challenge.
New, and what you didn't do before is also that it was originally as a series. How was it to work with a series? Did it lead you also like from the small book to another small book, or you had already the script for the whole big book?
No, very early on, I was intimidated by the idea of doing another graphic novel. Because I'm getting old, I didn't want to disappear into my cavern for nearly a decade and work in isolation, only to release a book and have it perhaps dismissed by critics in one fell swoop. I wanted to work in smaller chunks and get feedback from readers and critics that might actually still be constructive if I got it in real time. Also, I had hit midlife crisis in my career where it just wasn't very fun or compelling to make graphic novels. So I was trying to fall in love with comics again, and by looking back to the format that imprinted on me as a child, which was these 30-page disposable newsprint comic books that I got on the newsstand, a very unassuming, unpretentious, disposable format. And I'd never worked in that format before. Unlike the other like independent cartoonists like Dan Clowes or Charles Burns or Adrian Tomine, all of them grew up in serialized comic books and moved to graphic novels. I started with graphic novels, so I was a little envious that I'd never had the opportunity to work in that format. And certainly it both simplified and complicated things to work that way. I mean, it simplified things because I could just focus on one chapter at a time. I did not worry too much about having an entire draft of the whole book. I focused on one chapter, like storyboarding, penciling, inking, coloring, publishing, before moving on to the next chapter. But that also slowed me down. I probably lost 2 years in the process of serializing because it demanded, a new cover and jacket copy and letters pages and lots of production. I was always being distracted by the demands of having an issue out. and then sometimes being distracted by the response to that issue.
It's not just one new book, but it's 12 new book, or 13 even if we want. On the one side we have the one complete, which is collecting the 12 episodes or chapters, and on the other side we have the 12 separated. I recognize that there is sometimes a difference what you put in a panel in the single ones and then in the whole book. How much different are they?
So once I finished the series, I sat down and read them all in succession, and I was not happy with it. I thought that each issue worked on its own. They worked as self-contained objects, but they didn't feel connected. There was a narrative arc that was missing. So I ended up adding somewhere between 60 to 80 pages of story material to the final book. And starting right away with the first chapter, I lopped off the 6 pages ending of the first chapter and added 10 new pages. And that kind of continued throughout the whole book. So they read quite differently. Even though they both have the same first page and they both have the same last page, there's a lot in the middle that gets reworked, rewritten. It's mostly additions. There's more addition than things removed.
And we miss the pages which your brother did for the single ones. Why?
So that was one of the pleasures of this series. Every issue had 1 or 2 pages of comics stories by my brother, written and drawn by my brother. There was also a letters page, like an old school analog letters page of readers writing in their own stories. And then I would do like kind of old school ads in the issues too. So that was a lot of the fun that's only in the series. When I finished the book, I just assumed that would also be in the graphic novel book, but my American editor did not believe they belonged. Their argument was that my brother's pages were really disruptive to the flow. If at the end of each chapter you suddenly had this random story by my brother. So I tried moving all my brother's stories to the end of the book. Like, this will be like a afterword. But then it did feel really tacked on and unnecessary. I tried moving them all to the middle of the book so that it could function almost like an intermission. And my editors hated that most of all. And their argument was, no, your brother's pages are just for the series. That's a special extra that the people that bought the series got. But this is your story now. And the final compromise is I talked with them and I talked with my brother, and we all picked our favorite 2 pages that he contributed that actually worked as, in my opinion, the perfect punctuation for the whole story.
In the title, the Ginseng Roots, we have the roots, which is of course the herb, the plant, what about the story is. But obviously it can be read different as the roots of descent, of the origin, of the provenience. You grew up in dirt and poverty. Your drawing line style is mostly thrifty, cartoonish. The poverty and the simple worker are often mentioned in your book. How far the background you come from influenced your style?
Well, definitely growing up in a rural setting, countryside, not urban on any level, I tend towards earthy, organic themes. I like to draw nature, and that sets me quite apart from all the great urban cartoonists that love to draw architecture and buildings. I would much rather draw a tree. And I also, if someone like Joost Swarta or Chris Ware, the great architecture cartoonists who also work with a very precise line, I tend more towards a dry brush calligraphic line that has that organic quality, like someone like Edmond Baudouin.
Yeah, and we are organic, so that wasn't a critic at all. What else did influence your style?
Well, each book comes from different influences, and a lot of times it comes from prose first. In the case of Ginseng Roots, it came from the science, food, and botany writer Michael Pollan. He wrote this book, Botany of Desire. It's about 4 plants that shaped human civilization as much as we manipulated them as species, about the apple, the potato, the tulip, and cannabis. After reading that book, I wanted to create my own book about plants. And then you mentioned Chinese woodblock printing and watercolors and painting and calligraphy. Those were the primary visual inspirations. And then within comics, Joe Sacco's journalism was my main inspiration.
The thrifty style stands in contrast to the complexity of topics and how the panels and pages are built. The compensation, also this is mentioned in the book. I need to ask, how far does the complexity of your book compensate something, and what would it be?
Well, someone said on this tour that perhaps it comes from a working class background, where growing up, the paper we had in our house was recycled from the neighbor, and it all had computer printouts on one side, and then the other side was blank. And it was a precious commodity because we were poor working class. So we would be compelled to fill up every tiny inch of space on that paper. You know, if we'd come from a more privileged background, maybe I'd be a painter because I would just see a piece of paper as this broad canvas I could make a couple strokes on. But because of the rationing of paper, I would just try to squeeze as much detail as possible in there.
Did you try to paint?
No, I've never really been drawn to other mediums, you know, and that comes from being working class too. We never went to a museum. We did not have a literary household with books in the house, but we did get the newspaper, and the newspaper had comic strips. So that was the first. Even long before we had a television in the house, we had the newspaper, so that was the first visual medium I had, and it imprinted on me.
You're mentioning the working class, not going, for example, to the museum, the poverty. The book speaks about the popularity in Korea as the original country of ginseng and its less popularity in the US also. My question is again connected to the working class in the book and mostly the comic art, maybe not in France, but at least in Poland and Germany, needs some support. So the artists work also as a graphic designer or similar. How far can you live from comics?
I'm pretty lucky to be one of the rare people that makes a living just on graphic novels. My friend and mentor, Joe Sacco, said there's maybe 10 of us in America that make a living solely as literary cartoonists. And Joe and I are 2 of the 10. You know, we're also not rich. You know, it's a matter of just scraping by month by month or year by year. It's always a miracle once you make it through tax time and tax season. But yeah, I've been lucky to make it this far. And, you know, before being a cartoonist, I was a graphic designer. That's true. And before being a graphic novelist, I was an illustrator. But for almost 20 years now, or at least 18, I've been able to just survive on graphic novels. Part of what helps is having largely what helps is having an international market. And, working with publishers around the world. So even if it's just a trickle of income from every country, you know, that sort of accumulates. And I think that is probably the biggest component for people who can make a living at it, you know. And, you know, maybe I feel privileged as an American because that's a pretty big market in America. But I feel that Europe is also more open to imports, and America is not. It's more resistant to bringing in material rather than exporting it.
As we met for the first time in Warsaw to the book fair and the comic book fair there in May 2024, I saw the huge amount of people waiting to meet, to talk with you, to get the book, to get the draw inside. I think I never saw such a queue, such a lot of waiting people for a comic artist in Poland. You were now also to the biggest book fair in Frankfurt, in Germany. What would you say if you would compare where you are more popular or where your books are more popular, Poland or Germany? Where were more people coming to you?
Well, if you're comparing those two events, Warsaw was bigger. Because Buchmesse, I think, like, it doesn't have the same dynamics with long lines as it used to have. Like, that's not the way the signing sessions are set up there. They're much shorter, and there's not the space to accommodate the queue. So, yeah, Warsaw was a bigger thing. I mean, for me, it's strange because Blankets came out 20 years ago, or 21 in the U.S., and the first event I ever did was a New York-based festival called MoCA. And I drew in 500 books that day in a single day. So since then, nothing has compared in my career. Like the very first event, the debut of that book was the biggest and most overwhelming So now I'm almost numb to the lines.
As a kid, you were helping your parents on a ginseng farm. That's the topic we mentioned. The Wisconsin ginseng and its taste are very famous in Asia. Long time was the ginseng root held for a panacea. It's not like this anymore, but still it's a very good natural product of health benefits, but also for losing health when we speak about the ginseng root industry. You speak about its stride in your book, but also metaphoric, as losing the roots, being deracinated, uprooted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there is a great irony to the product once it's produced on this cultivated monoculture scale. It's very susceptible to disease. It has to be doused in weekly application of chemicals, fungicides, pesticides, rotating cast of chemicals, and it also deposits a toxin into the soil that prevents the crop from ever being replanted on the same plot of land. So there are a lot of problems and ironies with producing a medicinal herb in this way. But the next generation or the next phase for ginseng growers is to return to a more natural environment and to grow in smaller crops within the forest, its natural habitat, under the canopy of trees, which create the perfect amount of shade for the plant that needs to be sheltered from the sun, and working in communion with a whole array of companion species. Plants, like humans, don't thrive in monoculture. You need diversity within a system. And those other plants are actually what shield it from, the diseases and blights that it's susceptible to, and also prevents that toxicity that it can plant in the soil when it's grown in density. So I think the only possible future of ginseng is finding a way to grow it naturally and sustainably.
The slogan we read in your book, "Make American Ginseng Great Again," connects to the election campaign slogan of Donald Trump, "Make America Great Again." The 2016 presidential election was determined by 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and at least Wisconsin. Here, the people believed in Trump's promise of bringing back manufacturing jobs to this working class, we read. But the American ginseng isn't great again. White Americans don't want to work in that industry. Many farmers quitted the business. There is anyway some regression in the US. How far is it also the result of Trump's presidency?
Well, of course, Trump's presidency also created this whole trade war and embargoes with China, like it shut down the trade routes again. And so it really hurt Wisconsin farmers pretty drastically. And so a lot of those same farmers that probably voted him into office were very disillusioned by his promises. Same thing with the manufacturing jobs. He had this whole scheme of establishing a giant mega factory, a Chinese-style mega factory in Wisconsin. And it got the largest tax subsidies in U.S. history provided to this Taiwanese-based company, which in the end never materialized because it would have been too great of an environmental threat to the region. And it actually was not going to provide that many jobs to working class labor. So it was all false promises, as you would expect of a candidate like that. And so that's what gives me a little hope for this upcoming election. I think people are a little more likely to see through the lies of Trump on this round, and that he didn't deliver his promises. And maybe, I mean, it's a difficult time because corporations rule the world and they rule both political parties, and they're displacing all forms of labor, and maybe humans need it financially, but they also need it as a sense of purpose, and I don't have the answer for any of those questions.
The stones in your book are a big symbol too, for example, as something what disturbed the ginseng root to grow. Just before we meet and talk now, the Sunday Times from London published a cartoon by Morton Morland showing Kamala Harris running away from Donald Trump, showed as a huge stone rolling down after Harris, trying to sweep her off the surface of the earth. How much is Trump a threat, a social, a political threat?
Oh man. it's hard to take him seriously. But that's the problem, because none of us took him seriously on the first round in 2016 and surprised us all. On this round, I'm more optimistic, but maybe I'm disillusioned too. And maybe he's not a giant boulder aimed specifically at Kamala, but just at the system in general, and that's why he appeals to voters, because they know the system is stacked against them. And so they just want to throw a dynamite stick in it all, and that's what he represents. He's almost like it's a destructive, almost anarchist sort of vote of like, let's just blow it all apart and see what we rebuild in the ashes.
You didn't dedicate much space to Trump's implication on the ginseng industry in Wisconsin. However, you did mention his connection to the boss of the Foxconn company, which was investing into the ginseng industry in Wisconsin. How different, if at least at all, would you write this aspect today in your book when you already know what happened in the past 4 years of Trump's presidency?
Well, I wrote those scenes in 2021. So Trump was no longer in power when I wrote those scenes. And I did have friends who discouraged me from even putting him in the book. Like, don't put him in the book. That'll put a timestamp on the book, and that'll give him more face time than he already deserves. But I felt pretty strongly that the book required the timestamp, and that you can't write about the current situation in the U.S., whether that's cultural, political, economic, social divide, without addressing Trump and that time. But overall, the book is not overtly political. It's just a subtle undercurrent through all of it.
If I stopped growing shank, I would feel lost too. It's just what I've done all my life. There will always be weeds. You go through bad years and good years. That last plot of land did not produce well. Most of the roots were lost. But the ones that survive are beautiful. You read in your book. For me, it's also very metaphoric. Is it still about the ginseng root?
Well, you just read probably my favorite page in an entire book. And that's the dialogue of Chua Vang, this Hmong farmer. And Chua was probably my favorite person I interviewed in this whole project of 80 different interview subjects. We also became friends during the course of the project. I think we saw a lot of similarities between the path of a farmer and the path of an artist, and this difficult labor of love that sometimes you reap a harvest and sometimes you have total crop failure.
Of a human then. Similarities of a human then.
You're right. Yeah, all of the above. But yeah, and also just mortality, I think this book turned into a sort of meditation on the value of work ethic. And it was something instilled on me at a very young age. I was working 40 hours a week in the summer when I was 10. But after a life of looking back on that, just trying to reconcile if it's worth it.